Conclusion: challenging the way it is. Speaking of the murder of her sister, Lainey E., Danielle E. described a conversation with her uncle in which her sister's death as an Indigenous woman was described to Danielle and, quote, just the way it is. And I just learned at a very early age that, Aboriginal women were disposable. And I learned that at 18 when my sister Eleanor E. was murdered. And I kept asking my uncle, well, how come nobody's looking after, why aren't the police doing anything about it? What's going on? And I was told that's just the way it is. It was just accepted of way of life that our sisters and family, especially women, at the hands of violence. I couldn't. It was hard for me to, accept that. This chapter has analyzed testimony heard by the National Inquiry in terms of human security, as defined both by international organizations and rights advocates, as well as by women, girls, and 2 SLGBTQIA people we heard from ourselves. We have articulated how the concept of human security and the barriers to it are manifest in 4 key pathways that work to maintain colonial violence: intergenerational trauma that is left unresolved, economic and social marginalization, a lack of political, institutional, and public will to address the problem, and a persistent ignorance of the agency and expertise of Indigenous women themselves. In doing so, this chapter has revealed how colonial values are reflected in the organizational or operational level of service delivery in ways that create barriers for women, girls, and 2 SLGBTQIA people seeking support from violence, homelessness, sex trafficking, or the sex trade, and the other forms of social assistance, education, and training. Moreover, in failing to recognize the realities of Indigenous women living with the impacts of intergenerational trauma, these services further compromise the safety of women and girls. The witnesses who appeared before the National Inquiry stressed the importance of a dramatic reversal of policy and of attitudes towards those who find themselves targeted daily for violence, a reversal that begins in transforming relationships and addressing discrimination, racism, and misogyny at the very root. In much of the testimony, family members and survivors talked about how encountering racist and stereotyped beliefs about Indigenous women, girls, and 2 SLGBTQI people was one of the most explicit barriers that Indigenous women faced in seeking services, and that these attitudes directly related to the failure to find safety in their lives. As Ina C. explained, I remember when I lived in the bush with my grandmother, and my grandmother never seen a white person until I was taken away to school. And she used to hide me under her skirts, calling my dad for me not to be taken away. And we used to live in a bush, in a tent, even in the wintertime. I remember that. And I was always so warm, never hungry, just me and Grandma. And then my dad took us to Pickle Crow Mine, where he was a miner, and that's where things changed. And they learned about booze. They learned how to fight their women, things like that. It was never like that before. I don't even remember ever getting hit by my parents or even by my grandma. I have really good memories of that, and I just long for that, where we loved each other. I would never, ever think of hurting another person, and yet we still get hurt by force, and it goes into murder. Only by acting in accordance with the wisdom and expertise offered by survivors and families of those whose lives have been taken by violence will the fear that accompanies and shapes the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and 2 SLGBTQIA people will be addressed. Danielle E. summarized this hope for a world in which the rights to security held by Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people are respected and protected. I have hope that something good will come out of this, that as an Indigenous woman, I don't have to walk on the street and be afraid, because today when I go somewhere, I'm afraid. And it's a fear that we all carry every day, and you get so used to it that it's like part of you. And it shouldn't have to be, because not everybody in society today has to walk around and be afraid the way Indigenous women are and girls. I have 7 daughters and lots of granddaughters, and I worry about constantly all day. I don't want them to become a statistic. This perpetual worry and fear, as a national inquiry heard, points to a deep need to reinvigorate the meaning of security so that families can have trust in the systems that they say have so often failed them. This means looking at what security means in communities and in families, and understanding that the most pressing need is the one to focus on improving relationships with survivors, with families, and with communities, as well as to support this process by providing adequate resources, training, and support for people working to improve the security of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. Findings: right to security. Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people continue to experience social and economic marginalization and the exclusion as a direct result of colonialism and of racist and sexist government policies. This marginalization and exclusion is the objective of the colonial policies of the Canadian state. Colonial policies violate the social, economic, and political rights of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people, and jeopardize their rights to human security and, in turn, safety. These colonial policies are tools of genocide. The Canadian state has caused Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people to be removed from their homelands and territories and from their families and communities. They experience disproportionately high rates of poverty and insurmountable barriers to obtaining secure housing, food, education, employment, transportation, and other basic needs. Indigenous children and the elderly are especially vulnerable under these circumstances. Marginalization and exclusion decrease safety and increase the risk of violence, and often force Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people to remain in violent and unsafe situations, or to end up in violent and unsafe circumstances in an attempt to have their basic needs met. The social and economic marginalization, compounded by complex and intergenerational trauma, also forces many Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people to resist the marginalization and to meet their basic survival needs by resorting to the sex industry, remaining in violent relationships, and joining gangs. This further marginalizes and endangers them. Marginalization and trauma are pervasive reasons for the institutionalization of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ2QIA people within the criminal justice system and in child welfare system. The safety of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ2QIA people cannot be realized without upholding and implementing social, economic, and political rights alongside cultural, health, and wellness and justice rights. A reliable and consistent livable income for all Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people is necessary to address the state of crisis related to their well-being and to their socio-economic and safety needs. Indigenous women, girls, and 2 SLGBTQIA people experience extreme rates of overcrowding and homelessness. The lack of safe housing, transition homes, and shelter impacts the health, wellness, and safety of Indigenous women, girls, and 2 SLGBTQIA people. The housing crisis is a significant contributor to violence. Existing social and economic services for Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people are often plagued by huge gaps in resources and infrastructure. Further, such services are often placed in unsafe areas and are not culturally appropriate, thereby perpetuating a lack of safety and security. Indigenous women, girls, and 2 SLGBTQIA people continue to experience disproportionately low rates of educational achievement and high rates of unemployment. Employment opportunities and services, as well as resources to promote educational and employment success, are urgently needed as a way to combat social and economic marginalization and violence, and to support community and individual safety.
Dedicated to my beautiful sisters, aunties, nieces, ancestors, coming generations, and non binary family. To the matriarchs who passed away, unrealized powerhouses, I stand in solidarity and hope, voicing your legacy wherever I go, in all the spaces I find myself.